The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned crisp and clear over the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Seaman First Class James Rasmussen stretched as he emerged from his quarters aboard the USS Arizona, breathing in the salt-tinged air that carried the distant scent of tropical flowers. Like most of his shipmates, he had no idea that in less than 2 hours, his world, and America's place in it, would be forever changed. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the balcony of his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, sipping his morning coffee and reviewing the latest intelligence reports. The Pacific Fleet commander had received warnings about potential Japanese aggression, but most strategists believed any attack would come against British or Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. The idea that Japan would dare strike American soil seemed almost unthinkable. Meanwhile, 350 miles north of Oahu, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo paced the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi. The Japanese strike force, consisting of 6 carriers and their escort vessels, had maintained radio silence for 12 days as they approached their target. Nagumo carried with him the hopes and fears of an empire that believed this single devastating blow would cripple American naval power in the Pacific and secure Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia. The plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was audacious in its scope and timing. Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. He knew that Japan's only hope lay in delivering such a crushing blow that America would sue for peace rather than endure a prolonged Pacific war. "I can run wild for 6 months," he had told his superiors, "but I have no confidence for 2 or 3 years." As dawn broke over the Pacific, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave of 183 aircraft from the Japanese carriers. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters climbed into the morning sky, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that would soon announce Japan's entry into global war. The pilots, trained for months in the shallow waters of Kagoshima Bay to perfect their torpedo runs, carried with them the weight of their nation's ambitions. According to historical accounts documented in Walter Lord's Day of Infamy and other authoritative sources, the American military presence at Pearl Harbor represented the heart of Pacific naval power. 8 battleships of the Pacific Fleet lay moored along Battleship Row like sleeping giants, their crews largely unaware of the approaching danger. The USS Arizona, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, California, Nevada, and Oklahoma represented decades of American naval engineering and the backbone of Pacific defense. Back in Washington, Secretary of State Cordell Hull prepared for what he expected would be another round of diplomatic negotiations with Japanese envoys. The Hull note, delivered to Japan just weeks earlier, had demanded Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, terms that Japanese leadership found unacceptable. Yet even as tensions escalated, few American officials believed Japan would risk a direct confrontation with the United States. The stage was set for a morning that would transform America from a reluctant participant in global affairs to the dominant superpower of the 20th century. As Fuchida's aircraft approached the mountains of Oahu, the age of American isolationism was about to end in fire and thunder. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor like thunderbolts from a clear blue sky. Commander Fuchida, circling high above the harbor in his Nakajima bomber, surveyed the scene below and transmitted the code words that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. Seaman Rasmussen was in the mess hall of the Arizona when the first explosions rocked the harbor. The lights flickered, and the massive battleship shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. Through the portholes, he could see columns of black smoke rising from Ford Island and the distinctive rising sun insignia on aircraft diving toward the moored fleet. "This is no drill," someone shouted, and suddenly the mess hall erupted in chaos as sailors scrambled for their battle stations. The Japanese attack unfolded with devastating precision. Torpedo bombers, their aircraft modified to carry specially designed aerial torpedoes effective in shallow water, skimmed just 50 feet above the harbor's surface. The torpedoes, equipped with wooden fins to prevent them from diving too deep in the 40-foot harbor, struck the battleships with thunderous explosions that sent geysers of water and steel fragments high into the morning air. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey, duty officer at the Ford Island Command Center, witnessed the first torpedo strike on the USS Oklahoma and immediately sent out the radio message that would alert the world. AIR raid, Pearl Harbor X, this is not drill. Within minutes, radio operators across the Pacific were transmitting the news that would bring America fully into the Second World War. Admiral Kimmel, still in his white uniform, watched in stunned silence as his fleet came under attack. The USS Arizona, pride of the Pacific Fleet, took a direct hit from an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion, visible from miles away, lifted the 35,000-ton battleship out of the water before she settled. Back, her forward section completely destroyed. Over 1,000 sailors and Marines died in that single devastating blast. The USS Oklahoma, struck by at least 5 torpedoes on her port side, began listing heavily to port. Captain Howard Bode ordered "abandon ship" as the battleship continued to roll over, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks. Those who escaped described the nightmarish scene of their ship slowly turning turtle, her hull rising like a massive steel whale breaking the surface. Dive bombers screamed down from high altitude, their bombs finding targets throughout the naval base. Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and other airfields came under simultaneous attack, with Japanese fighters strafing parked aircraft to prevent American planes from mounting a counterattack. The few American pilots who managed to get airborne faced overwhelming odds, though some, like Second Lieutenant George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, shot down several enemy aircraft in desperate aerial duels. As reported in contemporary accounts, from the Honolulu Star Bulletin and other newspapers of the period, the attack lasted approximately 2 hours, but felt like an eternity to those under fire. Sailors fought back with whatever weapons they could find, machine guns, rifles, and even pistols aimed at low-flying aircraft. The destroyer USS Ward, which had actually detected and attacked a Japanese midget submarine hours before the air raid, continued to fight despite being heavily damaged. The human cost mounted with each passing minute. Hospital ships and medical personnel worked frantically to treat the wounded, while rescue teams searched through twisted wreckage for survivors. The harbor's water, slick with oil from ruptured fuel tanks, caught fire in several places, creating an inferno that trapped many swimmers trying to reach shore. By 10 a.m., the last Japanese aircraft had disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented destruction. The backbone of America's Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Over 2,000 Americans were dead, and the United States found itself suddenly and dramatically thrust into a global war that would reshape the entire world order. In the immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, America's response revealed both the nation's vulnerability and its remarkable capacity for resilience. Within hours of the last Japanese bomber disappearing over the Pacific horizon, rescue operations began in earnest throughout the smoking ruins of the naval base. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg of the USS Arizona had gone down with his ship, but his executive officer, Commander Samuel Fuqua, organized rescue efforts despite severe burns covering much of his body. Sailors and Marines worked side by side, cutting through twisted steel to reach trapped survivors. The harbor's oil-slicked waters continued to burn, forcing rescuers to navigate carefully between floating debris and the bodies of their fallen comrades. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would soon replace Admiral Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet, later observed that the Japanese had made 3 critical errors in their attack planning. They had failed to destroy the naval base's massive fuel storage tanks, which contained millions of gallons of oil essential for fleet operations. They had also neglected to target the submarine base, allowing America's underwater fleet to remain largely intact. Most importantly, the Japanese had not located and destroyed the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers, which were at sea during the attack. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack while meeting with advisor Harry Hopkins at the White House. The president, who had been maneuvering to support Britain's war effort despite strong isolationist sentiment, now faced the reality that America had been thrust directly into the global conflict. His famous words to Congress the following day, describing December 7, 1941 as a date which will live in infamy, would galvanize a nation that had been deeply divided about entering the war. The transformation of American Society in the wake of Pearl Harbor was nothing short of extraordinary. Manufacturing plants across the country began converting from civilian to military production with unprecedented speed. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, originally designed to produce automobiles, was retooled to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. Henry Ford's assembly line techniques, applied to aircraft production, would eventually turn out one bomber every hour. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers, taking jobs previously held only by men. The iconic Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of American determination, representing the millions of women who worked in shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants. The Kaiser shipyards in California perfected mass production techniques that reduced the time needed to build a Liberty ship from over 200 days to just 42 days. According to documentation from the War Production Board archives, American industrial output doubled between 1941 and 1943. The nation that had struggled with unemployment during the Great Depression suddenly found itself with a labor shortage as millions of men enlisted in the armed forces. The draft, which had been controversial before Pearl Harbor, now proceeded, with broad public support as young Americans lined up at recruitment centers across the country. The attack also marked a turning point in American racial relations, though progress remained incomplete. While Japanese Americans faced internment in camps, a decision that would later be recognized as a grave injustice, African Americans found new opportunities in defense industries and began their long struggle for equal treatment in the armed forces. The Tuskegee Airmen, trained at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, would eventually prove themselves as skilled fighter pilots in combat over Europe. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring American responses from his flagship in Japanese waters, began to realize that his carefully planned attack might have awakened a sleeping giant. American newspapers, which had been divided on the question of entering the war, now spoke with one voice about the need for total victory. The isolationist America First Committee, which had counted aviation hero Charles Lindbergh among its prominent supporters, disbanded within days of the attack. By the end of December 1941, America had declared war not only on Japan, but also on Germany and Italy, formally entering both the European and Pacific theaters of the Second World War. The nation that had tried to remain aloof from global conflicts now found itself at the center of humanity's greatest struggle, with Pearl Harbor serving as the catalyst for America's emergence as a global superpower. The spring of 1942 found America locked in a desperate struggle to rebuild its shattered Pacific fleet while simultaneously supporting allies around the globe. The Pearl Harbor attack had destroyed or damaged 18 warships, but it had also unleashed an industrial mobilization that would ultimately dwarf the productive capacity of all other nations combined. In shipyards from Norfolk to San Francisco, the sounds of riveting guns and welding torches created a symphony of reconstruction that continued around the clock. The USS Nevada, which had attempted to get underway during the Pearl Harbor attack and been deliberately beached to prevent her from sinking in the harbor channel, underwent extensive repairs that would return her to service by late 1942. The battleship that had limped away from Pearl Harbor would eventually participate in the D-Day landings at Normandy and the invasion of Iwo Jima. Admiral Nimitz, now commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, faced the daunting task of rebuilding American naval power while conducting active operations against the Japanese. The submarine base that had been spared during the December attack became crucial to American strategy, as submarines like the USS Wahoo and USS Tang began operating deep in Japanese-controlled waters, sinking merchant vessels and disrupting enemy supply lines. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 marked the first major naval engagement where opposing fleets never saw each other directly, with all combat conducted by carrier-based aircraft. Although tactically inconclusive, the battle demonstrated that American pilots and aircraft could hold their own against their Japanese counterparts. The USS Lexington was lost in the engagement, but the Japanese light carrier Shoho was sunk, and the fleet carrier Shokaku was severely damaged. 1 month later, the Battle of Midway provided the decisive test of America's rebuilt naval aviation. Admiral Yamamoto, seeking to eliminate the remaining American carriers and secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific, deployed virtually the entire combined fleet in an operation designed to capture Midway Island and destroy the Pacific Fleet in one climactic battle. American codebreakers, working in a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, had partially broken the Japanese naval code and warned Admiral Nimitz of the impending attack. The intelligence breakthrough, achieved by teams led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, allowed the Americans to position their outnumbered forces to maximum advantage. The three American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, faced 6 Japanese carriers supported by the most powerful fleet Japan had ever assembled. According to accounts preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives, the Battle of Midway turned on a single moment of extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from the Enterprise, made a crucial navigation decision that brought his aircraft over the Japanese fleet just as enemy fighters were low on fuel and ammunition after attacking American torpedo bombers. The devastating attack that followed destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in a matter of hours. Admiral Nagumo, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, watched helplessly as his carrier force was annihilated. The loss of experienced pilots and aircraft proved irreplaceable for Japan, marking the beginning of America's offensive in the Pacific. The victory at Midway coincided with expanding American involvement in the European theater. The first American troops landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch in November 1942, while American bombers began joining British Royal Air Force raids over occupied Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator became symbols of American air power, carrying the war directly to German industrial centers. On the home front, rationing and bond drives became part of daily life as Americans adjusted to total war. Victory gardens sprang up in backyards and vacant lots as civilians contributed to the war effort by growing their own vegetables. Hollywood stars like Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart enlisted in the armed forces, while others like Bob Hope entertained troops overseas, boosting morale among servicemen fighting thousands of miles from home. The attack that had been intended to cripple American power had instead awakened an industrial and military capacity that would prove decisive in the global conflict. By late 1942, American shipyards were launching new vessels faster than they could be sunk, and American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, and munitions in quantities that astounded both allies and enemies. By 1943, the industrial mobilization sparked by Pearl Harbor had transformed America into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The same shipyards that had witnessed the burning hulks of the Arizona and Oklahoma now launched new vessels with remarkable frequency. The USS Iowa, first of a new class of fast battleships, slid down the ways in August 1942, embodying American determination to not merely rebuild, but to surpass what had been lost. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, marked America's first major offensive operation in the Pacific. Marines who landed on the jungle-covered island faced not only determined Japanese resistance, but also tropical diseases, supply shortages, and the psychological challenge of fighting an enemy who had seemed invincible just months earlier. The 6-month battle for Henderson Field became a grinding war of attrition that ultimately demonstrated American superiority in logistics and industrial production. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Force, embodied the aggressive spirit that had emerged from Pearl Harbor's ashes. His famous message to his fleet, "Kill Japs, kill more Japs," reflected the fury that still burned in American hearts. The admiral, who had missed the Pearl Harbor attack because his task force was delivering aircraft to Wake Island, now led the Pacific Fleet's drive toward the Japanese home islands. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, conducted by the 8th Air Force based in England, demonstrated America's commitment to fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The daylight precision bombing missions, flown at enormous cost in aircrew casualties, targeted German industrial capacity, while British RAF forces conducted nighttime area bombing. The combined bomber offensive, as it became known, brought the war directly to German cities and factories. General Curtis LeMay, who would later command the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, developed the tactics that maximized the effectiveness of American heavy bombers over Europe. The B-17 and B-24 formations, protected by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, struck deep into German territory despite heavy losses to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. As documented in official Army Air Forces records, the Schweinfurt raids of October 1943 exemplified both the courage and the costs of the bombing campaign. American bombers attacking German ball-bearing factories suffered devastating losses, 60 aircraft and 600 aircrew in a single day, but demonstrated that no target in Nazi Europe was beyond American reach. The Pacific Submarine Campaign, operating from bases that had survived the Pearl Harbor attack, began to strangle Japanese merchant shipping. Submarines like the USS Silversides and USS Flasher, operating in the waters around Japan, sank hundreds of cargo vessels carrying raw materials essential to Japanese war production. The same oil tankers that might have supplied fuel for another Pearl Harbor-style attack instead rested on the ocean floor, victims of American torpedoes. The development of radar technology, accelerated by wartime necessity, gave American forces a crucial advantage in both theaters. The radar operators who had detected the incoming Japanese attack on December 7, 1941, but had been ignored by their superiors, were vindicated as radar became essential to air defense, naval operations, and strategic bombing missions. Women's contributions to the war effort expanded far beyond factory work. The Women's Army Corps, Navy Waves, and other military auxiliary services provided essential support roles that freed men for combat duty. Test pilots like Jacqueline Cochran flew military aircraft from factories to training bases, while the Office of Strategic Services employed women as intelligence analysts and operatives behind enemy lines. The Manhattan Project, America's secret program to develop atomic weapons, represented the ultimate expression of American industrial and scientific capacity. Scientists and engineers working at facilities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee and Hanford, Washington, labored to create weapons that would make another Pearl Harbor impossible by bringing the war to a swift conclusion. By the end of 1943, American forces were advancing on multiple fronts. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign had begun with the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, while in Europe, Allied forces had invaded Italy and were planning the cross-channel invasion of France. The nation that had been stunned by a surprise attack was now taking the offensive on a global scale, demonstrating the transformation from victim to victor that Pearl Harbor had ultimately produced. The final phase of America's transformation, from Pearl Harbor victim to global superpower, began with the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. The massive amphibious invasion of Normandy, involving over 150,000 Allied troops, demonstrated American industrial capacity and military organization on an unprecedented scale. Landing craft that had been mass-produced in American shipyards carried soldiers equipped with weapons and supplies from factories that had converted from peacetime production in the wake of Pearl Harbor. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Force, embodied the new American role as leader of the democratic world. The officer who had been serving in the Philippines when Pearl Harbor was attacked now directed the liberation of Western Europe, coordinating American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces in the largest military operation in history. In the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz launched the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces to Japan's doorstep. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, resulted in the destruction of Japanese carrier-based aviation. The same tactical principles that had given Japan victory at Pearl Harbor, surprise, concentration of force, and superior pilot training, now favored American forces equipped with better aircraft and supported by overwhelming industrial production. The capture of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in the Mariana Islands provided bases for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers that would carry the war directly to Japan. These massive aircraft, representing the pinnacle of American aviation technology, could strike targets 1,500 miles away, bringing Japanese cities within range of sustained bombing campaigns. General Curtis LeMay, transferred from the European theater to command the 21st Bomber Command, initiated the firebombing campaign that would devastate Japanese urban areas. The March 9, 1945 raid on Tokyo killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, demonstrating that America now possessed both the will and the capability to bring total war to the Japanese home islands. As Allied, Forces advanced on multiple fronts. The scientific and industrial mobilization that had begun after Pearl Harbor produced the ultimate weapon. The atomic bomb, developed by the Manhattan Project under the direction of General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, represented the culmination of American technological supremacy. According to documentation from the Truman Presidential Library, President Harry Truman, who had assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, faced the decision of whether to use atomic weapons against Japan. The alternative, Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, was projected to cost over 1 million American casualties based on the fierce resistance encountered at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Enola Gay, a B-29, named after pilot Colonel Paul Tibbitz's mother, took off from Tinian on August 6, 1945, carrying the uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The weapon that destroyed Hiroshima contained the equivalent destructive power of 15,000 tons of conventional explosives, obliterating the city center and killing over 70,000 people instantly. 3 days later, another B-29 dropped the plutonium bomb Fat Man on Nagasaki, effectively ending Japanese resistance. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, citing a new and most cruel bomb as one factor in his decision to end the war. The formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, marked the complete transformation of American power since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz, who had rebuilt the Pacific Fleet from the ashes of December 7th, stood beside General MacArthur as Japanese officials signed the surrender documents. The battleship Missouri, sister ship to the Iowa-class vessels that had been built to replace those lost at Pearl Harbor, served as the stage for Japan's capitulation. America emerged from the Second World War as the dominant global superpower, possessing nuclear weapons, the world's largest navy and air force, and an industrial capacity that exceeded all other nations combined. The attack that had been intended to cripple American power had instead catalyzed the rise of American hegemony that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Pearl Harbor survivors who witnessed the surrender ceremony understood that they had participated in one of history's great transformations. The nation that had been shocked into war by a surprise attack had not only survived, but had reshaped the entire global order, establishing the foundations of American leadership that would endure for generations to come.